this is Carla Collins, and I'm going to show you all how to make a headband on a loom. It's going to be the kind of headband that goes across your forehead if you're a dancer. And what we're starting out with is this loom that I have. The loom's like 40 years old. It's a little beat up. It's got some duct tape holding down the wood slivers. What we're going to use today is this Nymo thread. It's a 3-ounce cone. It's size B. And I'm going to start out showing you all how to string that loom up. So first I'm going to take a knot, tie a knot, and I loop it around. On the end of that loom is a screw that sticks out of that wooden, that long wooden thing. Over the top is a coil, and on the other side is another coil and a wood thing with a tack on that side. So what I'm doing is I'm running the string back and forth from one side to the other, and I'm spacing it apart at every coil thread, and space it apart. If you're doing geometric designs, you usually want to have an odd number of spaces, like 7, 9, 11, 13, however big you want to go. It really just depends on your design, what your design is doing. On this one, I'm going to be going back and forth enough to make 11 spaces. And here I'm double checking the count, making sure I got 11, triple checking it. And I do. So there's no special technique here. I'm just going to wrap it around a bunch of times so that that last string stays secure and doesn't come undone at all. I'm checking the tension. It was a little loose, so I tighten it up some. Okay, it's all good. So here is some graph paper. I just printed a piece off of the internet, and if you look, I'm putting that blue line on there. To the right of it will be 11 beads for the 11 spaces that I made. So that's my center point right there. And at this point I'm just freehanding it because I don't really know what design I'm going with. I'm kind of just coming up with it on the spot. So I sped it up a little bit so you didn't have to spend 5 minutes watching me color it. So what I did was I went for a floral, just a flower. Okay, now I'm tying a knot. I'm tying my string around the outer string, the outer loom string. I'm putting 11 beads on there, and this is going to be my first row. And I'm putting those beads on the bottom side of my loom threads. So I have my beading string that I put on the bottom side of my loom thread, and I put 1 bead in between each gap on my loom threads. So on the next scene coming up, I got a close-up so you can look at it a little better. And what I've done is I've run it through a few times. Just to make it tight because it's my first row. Okay. So I'm going to get 11 beads on my thread again. And I put it underneath my loom threads. And now I take my needle and I try to make sure that that needle runs over top of those loom threads. And that's what holds the beads in place. So I put it on underneath and then I run it back over top of the loom threads. And now I'm looking at my pattern and I'm looking 3, 2, 1, 2, 3. 3 whites, 2 blue, 1 white, 2 blue, 3 whites. Alright, so I'm going underneath it. I use my finger to push up a little bit of pressure to make the beads fit in there better. And again, I run my needle over top of the loom threads. And what you see there is I kind of push them back with my thumb. And I count out my next pattern. And then I realized I don't have any red on there, so I got to put some red on there. Okay, so now I'm counting my pattern out. Some people don't need a pattern. I usually don't need a pattern, but I did one for the video. And it was a little helpful. Always give yourself some prep time to do things like that. Yep, so it's just the under over. Put the beads on under the loom lines. Run your needle over top of the loom lines. That's the most important part to remember. You want to watch your tension too. Like when you every time you do a new row, you don't want to yank on it. If you yank on it and make it too tight, then it gets bumpy and wavy. So you kind of want to leave a little bit of slack there. And that takes some getting used to because you naturally want to pull it too tight. But practice makes perfect. After a little while, you won't do that anymore. So I sped the video up here so you could just see the progress being made. And it's pretty repetitive, and that's why you get better at it the more you do it. And here you see I had drawn a green vine to put in between the flowers. And so I'm following that pattern on the vine that I drew. And I just keep the video on fast while it does this. Interesting thing about beads is they are considered animate. And if you're trying to learn Potawatomi language, it's really important to know what's animate and what's not animate. And so here I'm finishing off my thread because my thread's getting short. So what I did was I ran it through like regular, and so I went under the loom threads, I came back over top of the loom threads like normal, and then I turned it and I went back underneath the loom threads again. So I passed through it the third time, went underneath the loom threads again, and then I came out over top of the loom threads and I came back and went over top of it the fourth time. And I do that so that I don't have to tie knots. It makes it a little more secure, and it hides your, then you don't have a bunch of extra threads hanging out. And then I just cut that off. I'm starting a new row. I tied a thread back onto the loom thread all the way on the right. I put my 11 beads on it. I ran it under the bottom like normal and then over the top on the way back. And what I'm doing now is I'm trying to run my thread along the bottom of the beads again and basically do the same thing I do when I'm tying off a thread, except it's the beginning. On this kind of stuff, you don't have, on this headband, you don't have to connect your newly beaded row to the old row, because it's going to be followed by so many rows of beads that it's not going to slide or move away from it. You might want to take extra precautions on things like runners that hang down and have a lot of weight on them, but for headbands and stuff it's fine. So here I've got the video speeded up and a little edit there so you can see what the process looks like. Alright, here's a close-up. There's me going under and then over top of my loom threads. And then I run my thumb along it just to keep pushing it back on every row. Okay, so I had turned the camera off for a while, beaded that up, and it was maybe probably 3 hours worth of work. And so here I'm getting near the end of the headband, and I think my pattern just luckily ended around 20 inches. If I had ended it a little bit earlier, then it would have been too short, I think. 20 inches is a good size for a headband for an adult. If I had ended it before, it'd be good for a kid. If I made it like one more row of, the flowers and the petals, then I could have did it for a man's hatband probably. But I'm just going to end it at that length right there. And now I'm going to show you how you tie it off. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to have that volume going. Okay, so what I'm using here is a Band-Aid. I like to use Band-Aids because they are not as thick as tape, and they stick way better. And if you use the Band-Aids that are like the flexible Band-Aids instead of like the smooth plastic feeling Band-Aids, then that's better. The flexible ones really stick to each other. They lay pretty flat. They don't come off. They won't slide down your ropes ever. So I'm going to move it up here and put the Band-Aid on the other side as well. And if you notice, when I put the Band-Aid on, I leave a little gap in between the beadwork and the Band-Aid. Because you do pull the threads in a little smaller than the loom work, it'll leave like a little ripple there. So that's what the space in between eliminates, that ripple. And here's where I can cut it off the loom. And I'll just take those threads off later. So here you see it's off the loom. That's kind of what it looks like. Kind of moving it around to show you it's not really fragile. It's not going to fall apart. It's pretty sturdy. As long as your ends are taped up, you're good. And because we ran through the first row and the last row so many times, the beads aren't really going to slide off very easy anyways. And so here I got me a piece of paper measured out about the size of the headbands. I just guesstimated it. And tracing that on the leather so that I'm close to the size of the headband. And here, just cutting out little pattern or a little piece to tie it off. So I'm cutting the fatter piece to go back behind the loom work. You'll see in a minute what I mean. And then this thin piece is going to be the ties. Now the ties, I left a little chunky on this. I'll probably trim them down later. You don't want to go too thin with the ties, because if you pull it too tight, they can break on you, and then it's a little bit of a pain to re-put a different back on it again. But I mean, before I give this to somebody, I'll probably make those tie ends a little bit thinner. So anyhow, I've got two, one for each side. Here I'm getting me a piece of thread. I'm trying not to make it too long. So at this point, you don't want your thread too long, because then it kind of knots up and gives you a hard time. And we don't want that. Okay, so I got my knot. Now, the hardest part of doing the backing is coming up here, just because it's awkward to hold, and it's just a little awkward. It's just a little hard at first, a little difficult. In Potawatomi, you would say snug it. It is difficult. Snug it. Okay, so I'm running that through there, just making a loop. The end there is your first knot, kind of to anchor it to that. So what I do is I go over to the next bead. Oh, okay, so here my leather was really weirdly thick on that spot, so I was having a hard time getting through it. And so at first I thought, well, maybe I'll just come up to the back, but then I changed my mind again. At this point, it's kind of like you just wing it. You just kind of figure out what's working best for you, but this is what I do. So here I gave up, got the pliers, and I'm just hold it, and I try to put enough pressure on the back to hold it against the beadwork, and I push through on the pliers with the needle. And what I'm doing is before I pull that loop tight, I run my thread through my loophole. We can't really do a close-up at this point, because when I tried to zoom in, it took it off the screen in the editing, so unfortunately you can't see too well what I'm doing. I'm sure it's got a name for whatever kind of loop it is. Anyhow, so I go through on the next bead, or the next gap between the next beads, and push it through there, and then I put my needle through that little loop, and then pull it tight. And if I don't put my needle through that little loop, then my loom work will get tacked down at a slant, and it just makes it a little bit bumpier. So I just run it through that little loop at the end just to minimize the bumps. But if you don't do that, it's fine. Everybody's got certain things they like to do when they're beading, and the more loom stuff you do, you'll have certain things you like to do too, if you're a beginner. Okay. So now I've got that end done, and I'm going to run through there just to put an extra knot in there. Now it looks like I'm going to stab myself over and over again. So when you're doing this, if you're new, you really got to be careful and be aware of where your fingers are. Just from years of beading experience, I don't stab myself very often. But I mean, I do every once in a while. Probably for every 100 hours I bead, I might stab myself once somewhere. Oh, and when you're beading, so your fingers get pretty tough. They won't be the most beautiful looking fingers. Like, you'll have calluses and stuff like that. But a little tip is, if you soak your fingers in salt water before you go to bed and then don't rinse them off, just let them dry and go to sleep. When you wake up, you'll have like pretty good calluses for beading, so that's pretty helpful. I guess guitar players do that. My dad used to bead, and he also used to play a guitar just for fun, and he told me that. And then I did it, and I'm able to keep nice beater calluses on my fingers, which is important because it gets pretty painful if you don't have the calluses and you're beading for a lot of hours. Okay, so here's a close-up. I was able to get it zoomed in where my hands were still in the picture. So look, I'm pushing through the gap between those two beads. And then right before I pull it tight, I got that loop. I put my needle through that loop, and then I pull it tight. And then I go to the next bead. And when you're doing it, don't feel bad if it kind of looks like a mess, because it just looks like that. But the further down you go, then your original knots start to look better. And I'm speeding it up here. Now when I came across the bottom, I just sewed through the right through the beadwork, right through the leather, kind of tacked it down. It does make it a little puffy on the very end, but it's the end, and nobody's really going to come up to you and look that close at the end of your beadwork. So now where I finish this end, I run it through a row of beads to the other side, tie my knot. Well, I guess I'm going through a loop here. And remember, that's where that leather was real stiff when I first started, so I'm having a little bit of a hard time again. So it's looking pretty solid on there. And I'm just going to go back through the row underneath it, just because. And then down here, I'm going to cut that. I'm going to do a single knot. Oh, so those are my threads from my very first knot. I didn't cut those threads off, so that's what I'm cutting off right there. And now I've gone all the way around, come back, I'm doing my single knot, and here I'm just doing a double knot over it. It'll really come undone very easy when you do it like that. And now I'm pulling it tight. Now remember, when you're beading, I had said earlier, like, just make sure you don't pull things too tight when you're doing your loom rows, and same thing when you're tacking stuff down. Give it good tension, but tighter is not necessarily better. And so now I'm just trimming it down so it looks nice. And this I got on fast forward because it's just the other side. And so that's how you do it. And like I said, this will be a headband for a dancer, like the kind that goes across their foreheads, not the kind that go like over top of their hair. And it'll tie in the back of their head, like maybe where, I don't know, like the middle of the back of their head.